I'm now going to try to gracefully transition to our morning plenary keynote, who is introduced to us by the LIST National Creative Placemaking Team. Lauren Hood is a native Detroiter and an AfroUrbanist working at the intersection of Black aspiration and city change. Applying a reparations lens to her work, Lauren employs the strategies of storytelling, visioning, and relationship building to addressing a community's past harms, present needs, and future hopes and dreams. Credentialed and experienced as both a community developer and an equity facilitator, she holds space for otherwise difficult conversations that allow practitioners and citizen stakeholders to understand and value each other's contributions while working towards transformational outcomes. Lauren, we are so grateful that you joined us for this morning's plenary, and we are very much looking forward to being inspired by your incredible work.
Thank you, Julie. And thanks to the group that went before. What a powerful way to kick off a convening like this. I'm just thinking of all the places, all the uncomfortable places where planning and development happens, where if we opened with something like that, how our conversations and our outcomes would be different. So thank you. I'm going to find my presentation here, sharing the screen. The slideshow. So can someone just give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Perfect. So what I want to talk about today is really it's about an approach to doing equitable development. First of all, I think if you were to ask people what their definition of equitable development was, you'd get a ton of different answers. And in my mind, equitable development is kind of in the response place. And I'm trying to think of what is a proactive approach to doing a community or development in a community. And current approaches usually center on the built environment, but it's my contention that what needs to be restored is actually the people. So I'm always thinking about what does that look like? So I just call it swagger. When the folks in a community have their spirits restored, they're in a state of being in their swagger. And I feel like the way to get there is to put culture first. It's something that we always leave out when we're doing community development. We have all these other priorities, but it's my contention that if you focus on the culture, people's spirits will be restored and you'll see swagger back in Black communities. I say Black because that's where I'm usually working and I'm a Black person, so I'm always thinking in terms of Black, but it really could apply to any community of color. And I always start with an identity slide because these are the things that are, shaping my opinions, the way I communicate, what I value. I think that people walking into a space doing a development somewhere that isn't where they're from, they're bringing all of these opinions with them, and we're not conscious of those. So I always want to raise for people like, who are you bringing to the table? Who are you bringing into this community? Where are your ideas coming from? And I realize I have kind of a double consciousness about community development. And some of those are like insider consciousnesses. So I'm a practitioner of community development. I work as a planner. I'm a middle-class person. I'm an appointee to our planning commission. So that means I have some authority and some access. And these are my insider roles when it comes to doing community development. But there are also some outsider roles. So the fact that I'm a Black person, I'm a woman and a native Detroiter, these are like the outsider roles when I think about community development as a practice where I'm from. So those identities have a different set of values and things that I'm questioning when I come into a place, when I'm assessing the value of a community development or a community plan. As a Black person, I'm always thinking about how inclusive is this? Is there, do I feel like I belong? Safety. There's a different kind of safety that I'm thinking about that from being a woman than being a Black person. Black folks in public spaces always have to worry about, is somebody gonna call the cops on me if I act quote unquote out of line? They're just things that we're considering as people of color that other people don't have to consider. And I think those things really shape how we do our work in communities. What is the cultural relevance of the thing that I'm working on? Does it speak to me? Does it speak to my culture? Does it speak to my people? And as a native Detroiter, I'm always looking for representation. So much of the work, at least where I'm at, is often led by people from out of town. So I'm always looking for the Detroiters on a project or a plan. Like, we're the natives. How is this going to benefit us if you don't have anybody on your team that can speak to what our values are? So just something to consider as we do our work. Who are you bringing to the table, and where are your ideas coming from? So what I find in the current practice is there's kind of a hierarchy. I find that the design professionals are usually at the top. So usually the landscape architects, the planners. That second tier is often the technical folks, the engineers, people that look at data and numbers. And on the bottom of the pyramid is folks like me. So I usually get brought into a project under the banner of community engagement, but I would argue I'm also providing the historical context, I'm providing the cultural context, I'm facilitating the difficult conversations that other people on the team sometimes don't want to have. But usually people like me with that socio-cultural expertise are on the bottom of this pyramid, along with residents, along with the people that live in the spaces that we're doing this work. And each of these groups of people, again, has certain things that they value and prioritize. So those design professionals are always thinking about the physical aesthetics. What does it look like? And what I find is they're usually building for other architects. They've got this set of design standards that only applies to people within their community, people that practice what they practice. It really doesn't get it, the aesthetics that the community wants. Those technical folks are really always thinking about precision and order and things you can count. How many cars drive past this place? How many people go into this business? It's very much about things you can count. But in the social cultural folks are always thinking about quality of life metrics. We're thinking about relationships, like how do people interact with each other in this community? How are people feeling about the changes that are happening? How are people feeling about the future of their community? We're thinking more about people and well-being, where those folks at toward the top of the pyramid are much more technically focused. But what I would advocate for is something that is more lateral. So in that first structure, it's very hierarchical, and you see that folks toward the top of the pyramid are often dictating what's going to happen. Moving forward, we got to flatten that hierarchy. How can we get to a state where we are co-creating, where everybody's expertise is valued at the same level? We really, when we're in conversation with folks in community, those of us that are hired to do something, kind of prioritize our own values and our own ways of being. And we really don't, we really keep what community wants kind of off to the side, and kind of, it's like secondary knowledge. We're not valuing it at the same level that we value our professional expertise. And I'm saying we need to flatten that hierarchy and accept that everybody's contributions have equal weight. I also think too, it is really important to capitalize on this moment. So now more than ever, we are seeing people outside of communities of color advocating for communities of color. We've got all kinds of people off the sidelines and into the movement. How can we take advantage of what's going on and use it to do bigger and bolder work in community development? I know that within my own practice, I'm working on a planning process for 3 neighborhoods on the east side in Detroit. And for the first time in any of these processes, we're actually having conversations on race. Like, how is it that in a city that is 80% Black, where most of the planning professionals are not, this is the first time that we're having a conversation about race in these planning processes. So I'm always thinking about how we take advantage of what's happening globally and use it as an opportunity to just be more bold. So I'm kind of talking about my work in terms of AfroUrbanism. So urbanism traditionally is defined as the way of life characteristics of cities and towns. But again, it really leaves culture out. What urbanism does is allows you to apply unilaterally these solutions in a Portland and take the same thing and apply it in Detroit. But those kinds of solutions don't really work unless you're considering the culture of a place. So as I talked about being more bold in this moment, I'm like, okay, we're just gonna call it Afro-urbanism, and we're gonna center the experience of Black folks in the creation of Black communities. And again, for people of color that are in planning disciplines, we've always done this. But again, I think it's a moment where we can now say that and we can prioritize it and encourage other folks to do it, and we won't get resistance because everybody in this moment is trying to think about, you know, how can we be more equitable? I'm like, well, you got to claim it, you got to name it, and now is the time where we can do that. So there are a couple of considerations when thinking about doing a kind of an Afro-urbanist approach, or it applies to any cultural group, but these are things you have to think about when you're prioritizing different groups of people. So the community is the client. I think that what I find is difficult is working with other planners and those technical folks. They're always worried about what the client thinks. So this project that I'm working on the east side in Detroit is for the City of Detroit Planning Department. So my colleagues are always like, oh no, what is the planning department gonna think if we do this? What are they gonna think if we do this? And I'm always like, well, what does the community think? Those are the folks that are gonna be left with the lasting impact of this planning process that we're engaged in. And it is my contention that if you do work that actually serves the community, whoever your technical client is, that person that's paying the bill, will be satisfied. But I'm always asking the question, like, what does the community want? Not so much what does that technical client want. There's always a shadow scope. So also what I find with those technical folks, they're really married to what is on paper. Whenever there are emergent issues in conversations with community, usually the response is, that's not part of the scope. We can't address that. But how can we not? I use this picture here because there were a few $1 million spent doing this park in a neighborhood on the northwest side of the city. And the questions from community were like, well, what about that abandoned house on my street? So what you can't see in this picture is on the other side of this well-maintained house is actually 3 vacant houses. The people on the street were like, when are you gonna take care of that? Or when can we get some loans to work on our own home? So there are people here who have roofs caving in. This woman told me she had to jump down out of her house because a couple of her front steps were missing. She's like, can we get home loans? So how can we think about solving those problems that aren't technically part of our scope? Like the group here was assigned to work on this park, but how can you work on a park and ignore all these other emergent issues that community members have? So think outside of what's on paper. Place-based expertise is greater than professional experience. Again, this is really driving home what I showed in that flattening of that hierarchy. How can, when we walk into a space, we really accept that the woman that has lived there for 40 years, she has a PhD in whatever that neighborhood is, and her knowledge and expertise should be valued as much as anybody with a planning degree or a community development degree. Really that knowledge is as valuable and oftentimes either more so than what we're bringing to the table. Relationships over real estate. So much of our planning and development processes really prioritize what's happening in that built environment. What are you gonna do with this commercial corridor? What are you gonna do with that vacant lot? And it's my contention in communities of color, it's the relationships that are more important. So in community of colors, we've had to rely on each other for our own survival. It's so much more than like, I need some sugar for a cake I'm baking. It's more like, I'm having some car trouble. Can you give me a ride to work? It's like, I'm gonna be away from my house for a while. Can you keep an eye on it? There are all these other ways in which people in communities rely on each other that really are more important to folks than what happens in the buildings that are there. Is my contention that the real estate, the built environment should only provide solutions that serve to promote those relationships within a community. Process over product. Again, we're usually driven by these technical outcomes, and people think so much about like the plan or what the development is. And it's my contention that if you focus on the process instead of the product, you will have outcomes that serve communities better. What I find when people are kind of, you know, angry in community meetings, they're really not angry at what the development is or the plan. What they're upset about is the way that they're not being included in the process. So how can you improve your processes in a way that makes people feel genuinely heard and included in what you're doing? Culture over commerce. I feel like when we're talking to people in communities, we're always asking questions. Well, really, it depends on who's funding it. So again, I'll talk about this project I'm working on the east side of Detroit. It's led by a lender who specifically funds small business. So all of the conversation is around what do you want to see in that vacant storefront? It's my contention that if you focus on the culture of the place, you'll actually leave the community with things that matter to them. So can we focus on what are the ways people communicate in this community? What are their values? How do people congregate and come together in this community? Focus on those things and not so much on what happens in exchange for money in this community. Be thinking about what do people prioritize? How do they engage? What's important to them? Transformations are greater than intervention. So I think that, again, I'm going to call out funders on this. We have these really short timelines and we have this limited budget, and we're always thinking about what are these tactical things that we can do in a community. We need something to put in that report for the end of the year. How can we, instead of looking for tactics and short-term interventions, be thinking about things that might be transformational for a community? So I show this picture, like the funder actually loved it. It's a farmer's market we did when I was running a community development nonprofit. So the optics are great, but for someone who understands what actually happens in this community, it still leaves something to be desired. So you've got, there's a separation of folks here, kind of like in a high school cafeteria. You've got people from a nearby university at some tables, and then you've got people from the community at different tables. So, you know, on first reflection, it's like, oh, everybody's in the space. But in my mind, the fact that they're not engaged with one another still leaves something to be desired. So how can we think about long-term transformation? Like what could have happened in this space to encourage communication between those disparate groups of people in the community? Answering those deeper questions gets you to something that's transformational instead of doing like a short-lived tactic that doesn't have much impact. So it's fun, but I think that some of these things that we do are, you know, they're more event production, and community development orgs aren't event production companies. They're there to transform. So how can the things that we're doing have more impact than just people having a good time? So I've kind of, I don't know, I'm a big fan of the word reparations and using that term. And it occurred to me one day that at the root of that word is repair. So I've been thinking about community development work as a restorative practice. How can what we do seek to repair the things that have happened in a place and to the people? So there's some principles associated with this reparations. Reconciling the history, empowering people, preserving culture, asset frame, activating imagination, and back to that, restoring the spirit. So I'll get into what each of these can mean. So when I say reconcile the history, how often are we considering what has happened in communities of color? So because of redlining, restrictive covenants, the Federal Highway Act, urban renewal activities that wiped out entire communities of color, how often are we considering the things that have happened there as a source of the current conditions? I think that there is some shame on the part of folks that live in communities, because we're kind of told it's our fault that they look like that, and a lot of people have internalized that. But when you consider the history, you know, it's not folks' fault. There are these policies and practices that have led to communities of color being where they are today, and I think we have to reckon with that when we're entering these spaces. There's a neighborhood in Detroit that gets talked about a lot as a victim of urban renewal practices. So it's called Black Bottom, and it was wiped out for a freeway that was built. And we talk a lot about like what the buildings look like, how they weren't kept up, and there were all these justifications from the government for why this neighborhood had to go away. But when we talk about this neighborhood, we don't think about what actually was lost. So around the perimeter here, you see some pictures of the buildings. You see the freeway there in the center, what came after. But along the side here, you can see like the actual impact of what was lost. So this was a Black community where there were 423 homes were lost. There were 151 Black doctors. There were Black social workers, lawyers, beauty shops, restaurants. All of these things are what was lost when we lost this neighborhood. And there are people here that grew up there still today. So when we're thinking about reckoning with the history, when my colleagues ask, well, why are people so angry when they come to community meetings? They're angry because of this. But if you don't know the history of the place, you're really operating at a deficit when you walk into a community to do work. This is a quote that I saw from a planning professor at U of M, and he was talking about what had happened during the urban renewal period in the 60s. But it really struck me how you could use this same line to describe what's happening in Black communities today. So tens of thousands of poor and mostly Black citizens were dislocated in the name of civic progress, saw their homes, businesses, and communities appraised, bought, and destroyed without their input or permission. So again, that was said about what happened in the 60s, but if you were to ask people in Black communities today, they would sign on and say this is still happening. Also reconciling recent history. So I just kind of want to put it into real and practical terms. So when I was running a community development org on the north side of the city, one of the institutional partners was a university. So the university had closed off streets in the neighborhood when they put a fence around the university, had promised the community like a community center, more access to campus and programs. There were all these things that were promised to the community that didn't happen. So in my mind, before I could do any kind of new development work in the community, I had to address that relationship. I had to reconcile that negative history. There wasn't a lot of trust on the part of the residents for this university that was like right in the middle of the community. So when you think about this anchor strategy where you leverage the resources of an institution in a place to kind of do development in the place around it, that kind of strategy doesn't work if there's no trust between the community and the institution. So at the core of what I was trying to do there was at least set the stage for some authentic conversation and dialogue about that fractured relationship. So the first thing I did was a community event where we put community members on the stage and had folks from the university in the audience. And we were like, all right, lay it on us. What are the problems? And then this second image here is we had a storytelling event. I'm a huge fan of storytelling. So we brought folks, the guy in the picture there with the suit is the president of the university, and he's listening to a woman from the Block Club. So what other opportunities can you create for institutional leadership to actually talk to folks in the community and repair those relationships? I think relationships are at the core of what goes on in a community, and understanding the history of the place helps you know where the work should be focused. To the extent that you can you empower people to use their own voice? Lots of times folks working in community development like we're the liaison or we're the spokesperson between community members and decision makers. It's always my contention that people will speak better for themselves. So to the extent that you can you create platforms for folks in the community to actually say what they need to say to decision makers? Revitalization efforts always occur at the, I said typically, but I think they always occur at the cost of culture. We have those different priorities and different sets of values, and we focus on change and what's good traditionally and not what's good for specific groups of people. So we're always leaving out culture when we're developing. And I think it's something that we have to focus more on. And again, it's about your value system. So someone from the outside could look at things going on in a community and be like, there's nothing really there. Why is this high school band performing in a vacant lot? Why are people dancing on this patch of grass? What is a healing session? But these are things that are special and unique for these communities. But again, it takes, checking your values and your priorities when you come into a place and understanding what is valuable for folks. We spend a lot of money on, and I know this is a placemaking kind of group, but I think we spend a lot of money on placemaking, but we got to understand that people in communities it's already a place for them. They're already doing things. They already know how to have fun. They already know how to come together and celebrate themselves and their culture. And it's such a strange proposition when you talk to people in communities like, we've got these placemaking dollars, what do you want to do? They're like, we're good on that. Here's the list of the other problems that you can help us address. But the culture piece, we got it. And I just want to make a distinction between placemaking and placekeeping. So the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture has these definitions, and really the distinctions are that placemaking leverages outside funding to strategically shape and change the physical and social character of a neighborhood. So it's about outside money there's a strategy behind how we're changing somebody's community. But placekeeping is maintenance of a place in its social fabric by the people who live and work there. Keeping cultural memories alive while supporting the ability of people to maintain their way of life as they choose. So can we be thinking about placekeeping in lieu of placemaking? The asset frame. So I know that when we're doing planning projects in different neighborhoods, we want to do an asset map. And usually what comes out on an asset map is a school or a park. It's my contention that when you're prioritizing culture, the assets are people. So one of my favorite neighborhoods in Detroit is called the North End. And if you were to look at the dry statistics of the place, high unemployment, low median income, low housing values. But if you take an asset frame approach, you can see that it's one of the most organized neighborhoods in the city as far as community organizations. There are a couple of people there that are well-known culture bearers that are valuable to the community. There's a bookstore that's become like a local place of learning and a source of pride for Black folks. Underground Resistance, UR, is an internationally known record label, and there's a history of techno music in the basement that's an anchor there. They have a co-op institute, and there will be a co-op grocery store there. So there are all these assets that you might not see if you were using a traditional approach to looking at the neighborhood. So how can we identify and leverage those kinds of assets, the people and those different kinds of institutions to make change happen? Activate imagination. So often when we're talking to community about a plan or a development project, the responses are around current issues. So I hear people all the time talk about trash pickup and lights on, but how do we get folks to think about the kind of future that they want? It's really limiting to keep people focused on present issues. I asked an open-ended question in a visioning session recently. I was like, of all the places in the world that you've ever been or that you want to go to, what is your favorite and why? And it really allowed an opportunity to unearth some ideas about people's aspirations and their desired way of being, so that we can think about planning outside of, again, just the built environment and addressing these current issues. How can we set folks up to have the future that they want? And lastly, back to the restoration of the spirit, getting back to that swagger. So all those things, those negative things that you heard about Black Bottom and that exercise that I just talked about, the first woman to respond of her favorite place in all the world was Black Bottom. Black Bottom. And this picture is some folks from Black Bottom. So all those negative things you hear about it, what Black folks here that spent time there love about it was the connection that people had to each other. There was a sense of pride because we owned all the businesses. There's just a swagger that folks had in Black Bottom that you don't see in other communities. So when we think about how we set the ground for community development work, can we be thinking about what steps can we take to restore the spirit? It's not always about restoring the buildings or the landscapes, but how do we plan for people to get to this state of swagger? And that is it. Wonder if I should leave that one up.
Wow, thank you so much, Lauren. I know we're on the Zoom here, but please show some love for Lauren using the reactions or some applause here. I think a lot of Lauren's words really resonated with our community here in Buffalo, and you know, what a leader in this work, and we have so much that we can learn and integrate into our work here. So thank you so much. We do have a couple of minutes for questions for Lauren. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Lauren, please drop it in the chat, and I'd love to send up some questions for her to answer. We've had an amazing reception, Lauren, here in the chat. There's a lot of love coming in over here. I know that there was one comment in the beginning from Broderick Kaysen, who was interested in learning more about transitional and transactional and transformational. When so much community money is grant or short-lived dollars. Could you talk a little bit more about that to kick us off?
Yeah, I think that the highest and best that we can do is set up frameworks for continued engagement. So something that I haven't been very good at and I'm reflecting on now is kind of, you know, I'll stick to those timelines and be like, well, you know, our work here is done at the end of the year, see ya. But how can you set up frameworks for community to engage with those decision makers beyond your interaction? I feel like those are the highest and best things we can do in order to make something transformational. Because again, it's about folks in community having access to decision makers. So how can you set up platforms for them to build those relationships so that they can activate change once you're gone? So yeah, at the root of it, I think, again, is those strategic relationships.
Thanks, Lauren. Lauren, is there a way, there's a lot of requests to follow your work. Is there a best place for people to follow your work?
I have a website, so you can go to laurenahood.com. I'm on Facebook. You can follow me on Facebook. What else? I think that's it for now. And at the end of the year, I will be transitioning from doing just independent consultant work to launching an institute. So it's always been a dream of mine to teach folks in community how to talk about their work. So there are folks already practicing AfroUrbanism in neighborhoods, but they don't see themselves as planners. They don't see themselves as community developers. And I want to give folks a language so that they can be taken more seriously, so that they can you know, take themselves more seriously and understand the work they're doing is actually work. Lots of folks just do this stuff like it's second nature, but if you give folks a language where they can talk about it as it's work, people will recognize it as such, and they'll have to be contended with when outsiders come in to do something. So it'll be to give folks in communities language to do the work. Also study Black city builders. So I have a master's degree in community development, and we didn't study any Black people's work. So I went to college in a 90% Black community, an 80% Black city, and we didn't study the work of any Black people. So it's my contention that if you teach Black folks what Black folks have done and are doing, it gets to this restored spirit state and gets folks in a place where they feel empowered to do something. So launching an institute where I could help people learn that.
That sounds amazing. Lauren, I have two related questions that came in. So a comment from John Washington, engagement is step one, but we need to force decision makers to give the decision making to the people. And also, what are your thoughts about the movement for community control of housing and land? From Dr. Henry Taylor.
Okay, I'll start with that one. I'm into the community control conversation. I think we need cooperative models for ownership, but what does it mean for community to have control? Is it a couple folks? Is it just community of color as real estate developers? I think that's a lot of what the equitable movement in Detroit looks like. We have all these programs for Black folks to become real estate developers, but I don't think the problem was that there weren't Black real estate developers. The problem is the dynamics in real estate development. It's the concentration of the wealth into one or two people. Whether those people are white or Black isn't the problem. The problem is that it's concentrated. So how can we think about spreading the wealth in terms of who owns property? But I also have a lot of questions about just ownership in general. I know it's important to own things because then you can ensure that you won't be displaced, but I'm not sure that's the right battle to fight. I think there's something else to be considered there, because there are a lot of buy the block movements too, like people pooling their money and buying property. But I feel like we're chasing what the capitalists do, and I don't know that that's the right way to do real equitable change. I don't know what is, but I'm trying to think outside of traditional, just like we must own things. Must we? Is that the thing? I don't know. And then what was the first question? I can't remember.
The first question was related to decision-making power in the hands of the people.
Yeah, I don't, that's tricky. I don't know what that means. We feel like we're creating platforms for people to be more engaged. I don't know what that looks like unless you put like neighborhood folks on a foundation staff. I don't know what real decision-making capacity looks like in the hands of the people. That's why I'm trying to think of approaches that are more ground up instead of responsive. How do we decide what we want for our own communities and then go look for funding to support it versus there are funds floating around? How do we fit our vision into what's out there? I think we just have to start with knowing what we want.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head a little earlier when you were saying that as people really are more involved in, speaking their voices in the process, that there will be roles in leadership that comes from that, and that changes the decision-making dynamics too. So I think this is, we have a lot of questions coming in and a lot of discussion that is really, really rich. So I encourage people to keep sending your questions into the chat. If there's specific questions for Lauren, we will for sure send them to her and ask for some follow-up. And if there are questions for future discussion for LISC programming, or if you need more information about a specific topic that Lauren has brought up, we can even ask for additional resources and speaker suggestions from Lauren too. So as you can see, there's a lot of energy surrounding this topic, Lauren, and we are so grateful to have you here with us in our program today and for sharing your work from Detroit. So last little bit of showing some love here. Let's show some love for Lauren before we transition to the next thing on our program.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.